What up, y'all? It's August the 29th, 2021. It's about 8 o'clock right now. I'm sitting outside the library. They just closed like a few hours ago. And I was trying to do this blog earlier so you can see my face, but I had a few things to do today or whatnot. But as far as this book is specifically about the first chapter, like I mentioned before. I'm gonna start this one off not too different. The chapter starts off talking about John Brown and then ends with Major Robert Anderson evacuating Fort Sumter on the 13th of April, but I get to that. But that's where the chapter ends at. But in between both of those events, as far as like Harper's Ferry as opposed to that one, they went into a whole bunch of different figures throughout that period during that time, leading up to the Civil War or whatnot. So like I researched the chapter thoroughly, but I included a lot of stuff. So like the way that I want to start the chapter off, instead of just going strictly in the chronological order of the chapter itself, I'm gonna kind of like remix the order, start a little bit before John Brown, but I'm gonna try my best to kind of keep it in tangent as I go along with the chronology of the chapter itself, meaning because I'm gonna go back to John Quincy Adams. I'm gonna start off during his presidency because I think it makes sense. The last historical blog that I did it about the life of John Quincy Adams anyway, and a few things went on during his life that kind of like serve as pertinent events as far as like the liberation of African Americans leading to it. And that chapter, or that vlog specifically, in which I did about him, it was quite a few things that I left out on purpose, only because I wanted to hit my deadline at the time. So I kind of rushed it a little bit, and I felt like if I would have included all of those events that I left out, the vlog would have turned out a lot longer, because it's a pretty good vlog with a lot of information outside of the book included as well. So it sort of suffices, and the vlog turned out 3 hours. So as far as like the beginning of this vlog, how I'm gonna start it off, I'm gonna mention an event that took place in South Carolina, the nullification crisis back then. I'm gonna start there because it was kind of like pertaining to the economics of what was going on, and African Americans, or the slavery institution, played a big part as well. Now, another reason it took me a while to finally do this vlog is because I pretty much read a whole nother fucking book also in addition. It's called Proslavery Arguments Maintained. The reason why I chose that, and I'm glad I came across that book, by the way, because when I was reading the first chapter of this book, they mentioned a lady by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she had came out with a book in 1851 that was very fucking popular. It had set a precedent. It was very successful. It was based off a series of arguments, or essays rather, about the harsh realities of slave life. So like 2 years after that, in 51 actually, that's when she published the book or whatnot, a year later. Now, it was another book that came out that turned out to be one of the most popular books on the subject as well, but it's anti-her book. So it's pretty much a compilation of 4 different authors, essays that they wrote, 4 main persons or whatnot, who argued intellectually for slavery. Now, I wanted to read the direct sources. Of course, I understand the arguments, based on what I learned throughout life in school as well. But I never read their direct sources. I read people that sort of argue that perspective as well. But as far as like the direct old sources back then, not too, basically during the period, the antebellum period before the Civil War, I found out about this book. The book is like 400, basically almost 500 pages long. Now, the first author is a guy named Harper Williams. He was a senator for South Carolina, only for like 5 months or whatnot. The exact year he served as senator, I forget, but I believe he died around like 1847. But as far as the book itself, Pro-Slavery Arguments Maintained, they start off with his essay, which is basically about 96 pages. And I read the entire, all of what he had to say. I wrote it down, I was gonna say verbatim. I pretty much translated where he was coming from and made sure I fairly represented it. His is pretty much a theme, so it wasn't really that difficult. It's a few things in addition, you know what I'm saying, a few like aggregates to his overall premise that he touched on. But I will try my best to mention him as well during this vlog when he becomes super relevant, instead of just like going through his book at the very end of this. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not cramming, but I'm incorporating many different elements of what I study, and I'm gonna speak on it off the top as I go in chronological order or whatnot. So that's why it took me so long to do this. And that's also why I'm doing this vlog. As far as about the book itself, that's the reason I'm doing it chapter by chapter, so I don't, you know what I'm saying, because like I say, it's a lot to break down. But going back to the nullification crisis, okay, that started in 1828, right, toward the end of John Quincy's presidency. Now, as far as like John Quincy Adams, you know, he was the president for he only served one term, so 4 years, 1825 to 1829. And as far as this period leading up to him, you know, just so I can give a little further background, of course, the first president of the United States was George Washington from 1789 to 1797. Then John Quincy Adams' father, John Adams, from 1797 to 1801. Then Thomas Jefferson, who served 2 terms from 1801 to 1809. Then James Madison from 1809 to, he also served 2 terms, come to think about it, from 1809 to 1817. Then after James Madison, James Monroe from 1817 up until 1825. Another guy that served 2 terms. Then John Quincy Adams, and then Andrew Jackson after him, but I'll speak on him later in a second. As far as John Quincy Adams, now this is 1828. Now, as far as the last vlog, you know, about the history of the United States, but more so just about like, you know, how the United States came to being during their war with the, you know, the Revolutionary War or whatnot. Toward the end of the book, they did mention about like John Quincy Adams kind of like being the first to read a lot of petitions pertaining to slavery and kind of tying up the Senate, and that's what helped them initiate the gag rule. He was basically one of the first people to filibuster there in the Senate. He kind of like circumvented the rules. They had a back rule to where slavery wouldn't be brought up, but he could not kind of disregard his obligations as far as reading complaints or petitions from his constituency. So he made a conscious, slick choice to read a lot of petitions pertaining to the complaints about slavery. So he's one of the first people to kind of like usher that in. Now, fast forwarding, 1828. Now, by this point, and I know I'm not incorrect on this, all right, the issue that was going on was a tax that was put forth, that was voted and actually passed, and it was called I forget the exact name, but it was a tariff. It was basically like a tax on British cotton goods. You know, the way that they wrote it down, like when I researched this in addition, they just kept saying like a tax on certain imports, like a 38% tax on certain imports, and then a 45% tax on certain raw materials. Now, being that, you know, the main product of the United States back then, as far as my knowledge, was cotton. I'm thinking they're talking about cotton because the British brought the majority of their cotton from the United States as well. So as far as like this whole industrial period going on back then, you got like new technologies that people are utilizing, especially on the farm fields and mills and things like that. Like you take cotton, people pick cotton, and then they kind of, you know, I never did it in my life, but I kind of know the process, how they, you know, basically translate it into clothing threads or whatnot. And so they had machines that was invented by this point, by 1828, to where it'd be done more efficiency and faster, and then a lot more of that. The Southerners didn't really too much have these type of technologies. So this is the context that's going on back then. Now, because of this, well, people domestically would buy their cotton goods or textiles. A lot of their, you know, like they were saying, like the northeastern states, for example, you know, the industry was kind of suffering from it because they was kind of getting knocked out of competition by British imports. You know, people would buy like cotton material that came from Britain more so than the ones that was picked and, sorted together here domestically in the United States, is what I'm saying. So those domestic companies would suffer more so from that. That was the issue that was going on at the time, but it kind of like to even everything out. That's when Congress put this law together as far as like increasing the tax on these imported goods from Britain. Now that was interesting when I thought about it, right? The well, I'm just gonna speak on it anyway. This goes back to Harper's Ferry. I mean, not Harper's Ferry, but Harper Williams. The guy that wrote the first, the first person that they kind of quoted in the book, Proslavery Arguments Maintained. He's the first guy, Harper Williams or whatnot. I'm not looking at nothing. I'm looking at my phone, by the way. So, in his book, based on his numbers, of course, along with the description of Africans being brutes and all that, but I get to that later or in a second. In his book, as far as the numbers, he said slavery, as far as like what slavery produced, economically speaking, accounted for anywhere between 2/3 to 3/4 of our trade, our foreign trade or whatnot. You know what I'm saying? So therefore, slavery was something that the South greatly depended on. Actually, the whole nation really. And even though the South was in the minority, it was still like a big boost to the economy. You know what I'm saying? Like this guy Harper was saying, like if you took a measurement of any other nations during that time, he named some of them. Even Brazil, he named Brazil. He named Colombia, Spain, Cuba, quite a few places. He even named England or whatnot, or the British or whatnot. And I believe at this time, as far as like when he referenced these different countries, I believe Brazil still had slavery. Or did they outlaw it? No, I think it was Colombia that didn't have slavery in existence. But anyway, he was basically saying like if you look at these nations, they're kind of crippled because they don't have slavery or they outlaw slavery as a part of their institutions. And if you took a universal, this is according to the arguments that this guy was making in his essay, which was 96 pages. He was like, if you took an objective look historically at every major civilization, every pronounced civilization, each one of them has slavery as a part of their institutions. And because it's universal, according to his perspective, because it's universal, that means it has to be ordained by God. It's like looking at it from a philosophical point of view, like what's more than likely the case? If this turns out to be something that's ubiquitous and practiced, that means in every society you have to have a natural, sort of like a natural caste system. You always gonna have, the way he put it, he was like, you're always gonna have, and this is before communism and all this type of shit. This is like published in 1853. He said you're always gonna have like a rich class, a very, very smart class. You're gonna have variations as far as the workforce. Certain jobs that people perform might take a little bit more brain execution as opposed to remedial work, etc. You're always gonna have a poor class. You're always gonna have a suffering class. Like all of this is supposed to be a part of the natural mechanisms of things. Now, the difference as far as what he was putting forth, because he acknowledges that there are and I'm not saying that to say that I agree with him, I'm just saying like his arguments. He says that there are variations as far as like levels of superiority and inferiority and various races, like even like Arabs. We call them barbarians and all that type of shit. Everybody, you know what I'm saying, Indians and all that. But the African itself, this is where it becomes exotic. This is where the exotic piece gets added to this philosophy of universalism as far as different levels of beings and people throughout a society. The African is a natural brute, the lowest on the caste system of human beings. And if you take an African and you put an African in its natural habitat, it would exhibit such characteristics of bruteism on every single level, even including the female, all the way down to sex, which also explains quote unquote promiscuity. So, in the American institution, the political and economic institution itself, it makes sense and it would be okay from God's perspective, because this universalism is reflected in every single civilization that has been up until this point. Therefore, philosophically speaking, being that the African also exhibit these innate characteristics, it will have to be also ordained by God, and it would make sense to keep this institution and also fight for this institution, because it also admittedly boosts the nation. Case of point, taking like a clear view measurement of other nations that outlaw slavery and compare where they're at economically to where nations where slavery exists, such as America at that time, is at. So he was saying like people that like most abolitionists, right? This is why I feel like this is a lot of fucking treasure. Not that I agree with, but I was reading the direct fucking unfiltered shit from these people. This is their perspective. So a lot of abolitionists and all these other people, they're led by grandeur, a lot of them. It feels good to think about it. Some of them are self-serving. Others are idealists. And he was saying like many abolitionists have never intimately, at that time definitely, he was saying, been around the slaves and actually seeing how they actually live. And some of them get so emotional that is, he's basically trying to say like they're living in their heads. Now, even though later on in the book, like when you read all 96 pages, he later on goes a little bit deeper. He's talking about like moralism and all that. I get to that in a second. I just don't want to veer too much. But, and hopefully I don't forget to mention it. But he was saying a lot of them live in their heads. And if you took a statistic look at slavery, the majority of slaves are also content in their condition. And within the institution, when you think about it from a more intimate level, they're not treated as bad as people such, like he kept referencing these abolitionists, like saying like their arguments, like they embellish the reality of slavery. He was saying like they're well fed, they just pretty much perform a duty. And then throughout his words, he'll like make a comparison. He'll say, okay, you take slavery and you compare them to the poor class in England, things even become much clearer, because he disagreed with this whole thing of, I'm gonna call it malleability of the mind. He didn't think that, blacks, again, going back to his main premise, which he did aggregate from a few times, this is an example. He was like, he don't believe that Africans and their descendants possess the type of mind to where they could really grow intellectually, and even if they made some progress, it wouldn't be too far. And as far as like those who are able to read, if you pay attention, their comprehension is not really there. You know what I mean? He was like, so anyway, so comparing them to the poor class, as far as like the people of England, he was like, even if you gave them this or you gave them that, you gave them a little bit more, like say you took slavery away, because you look at their innateness, it's inevitable that they're going to turn out to be a stain amongst themselves and also potentially within a society everywhere. That's what he was saying. You know what I'm saying? Now I'm gonna go back to now I referenced that ahead of time to also kind of say like, like these arguments, this is not how can I put it, outskirt type shit, because at the end of the chapter itself, who was it? Jefferson Davis, right? He became the president of the Confederate States. Him and the vice president, another guy named Alexander Stephens, the vice president under him of the Confederate States, referenced these type of arguments. They didn't reference Harper Williams himself, but in their speeches they gave, because let me see, South Carolina for the second time in history, because I'm about to explain the first time now, but the second time in history was in December of 1860, when they separated from the Union after Abraham Lincoln had won or whatnot. But a little bit after they separated from the Union, 2 months after that, in February, the Confederates, like these southern states, they all met in Alabama. They met in Montgomery, Alabama, and proclaimed themselves to be the Confederates or whatnot. And a part of their proclamation was that slavery is the Negro's natural, how can I put it? Basically, it was something that was naturally befitting for him. So in me referencing Harper Williams' points, I'm not going too far off the point. This is like the backdrop to some of the concerns of these people, such as South Carolina, for instance, who later on uh, seceded from the Union. But even though like this argument and the reasons for it is more so economic, you still always got that base tied to it, which is slavery itself. That's why I'm bringing this up, to keep that as like a further deeper context. But anyway, so because they felt like these taxes was unfair, and then you think really quick. This is another thing that I noticed, by the way, before I continue. I was thinking about the whole theme of it. Like Britain being the biggest purchaser of cotton, on top of slavery, making up for like 2/3 or 3/4 of of the trade between America and the rest of these countries. But being that Britain purchased cotton more so from America than any other nation at the time, I'm like, shit, that makes sense when you think about it. You look at like the clothing of the people back then and the cultural things and all that. It was like they were begetted from the British in the first place. So it would make sense, as far as like the styling of the clothing and all of this, that they would also purchase these textiles from like more so British companies, or that those textiles that were produced by the British, they were more so purchased than that which was domestically produced. And I'm like, okay, you got the clothing, you got shoes, you got like cotton that you might put on house furniture, cotton rugs, etc., all across the board. So it kind of made sense how like the northeastern states would be affected economically from that. People wouldn't purchase as much cotton material from domestic carriers, rather than those coming from the British or whatnot, and how it would take money out of these people's pockets or whatnot. So like the tax that was instituted, the tariff at the time, was supposed to make things more fair, but the South felt some type of way about that, particularly South Carolina. They felt like it was kind of taking money out of their pockets too, because the companies from Britain, for instance, like they might they'll have to raise their taxes in order to make up for this huge tax that's been put in Congress or passed or whatnot. It's hard to explain it, but I understand it. So so little conflict had occurred because of this, and I'm gonna say like by 1832. Because the government of South Carolina threatened to secede or whatnot. So, Congress put another bill together called the Compromise Tariff. Now, I believe that was that had to be, that was in 1832. Now, the vice president at the time was John C. Calhoun. Now, he was also somebody that was for slavery, but he was also for like because you had people that was arguing within South Carolina that they could disregard the law if a state found a federal law to be unconstitutional, then that state within itself would be able to disregard the law, and they call it null and void theory. And the vice president at the time was somebody that was supportive of this theory, so he wanted to resign as well and run for Senate, to be the Senate of South Carolina, so he could help fight for this or whatnot. Now, just before he made that move, a compromise was made, and then it was called the Compromise Tariff or something like that, or the Tariff of Compromise, and it was put in law July 1st of 1832. July 1st of 1832. Some within South Carolina felt like it was not good enough or whatever, so they was kind of preparing, getting their militia ready, their state militias and their troops ready for potential attack against the federal government now that they claim to secede. Because let me see, slightly before July 1st of 1832, No, actually, no. I'm correct. So they was planning on seceding and whatnot. And finally, I want to say March the 1st, another compromise was put together, and it greatly lowered the taxes even more. And then both like entities, you could say, I guess you could say, like the people, basically the people of South Carolina, the government of South Carolina was satisfied with that. You know what I mean? Because it was something called a force bill that was put in place, by the way, and the force by Congress, by the United States Congress. And the part of this force bill was like, okay, to also be able to prepare the military for a strike against these people as well, in case they choose not to return to the Union. But at the same time, on the opposite side of the fence, a part of this bill was the compromise for the tariff. You know, I might be saying that, you know, I might be quoting the name of the exact bill incorrect, but that was what was part of it. And this was put, this was made March 1st of 1833. And that's when the South Carolinians and their government fell back in place and decided not to secede from the Union. Now, that was one of the major events that took place, but like I say, that was during John Quincy's presidency. Now, just a few years after that, actually slightly before that, 2 years before that, and this is pertaining to leading back up to, this is like the collective sociological sentiment leading up to the Civil War. These are major events that took place. Now, 2 years before 1833 and 1831, that's when the famous Nat Turner Rebellion had took place. Now, that happened in Southampton, Virginia. He had planned it for a while. He only started out with like 6 people when it finally began to snowball, but it was something that he had planned for a while. He was purported to be a literate slave. Now, I was trying to figure this out, like how literate he was, because going back to the statistics as far as like the United States history, you know, literacy, like in general, I'm gonna say like what is it, by, it was supposed to be like 1774, 1776. At least 80% of the population, as far as men, were literate, and then at least 50% of the women were literate. So by the time you get up to like 1831, when the Nat Turner Rebellion happened, pretty much the general population was literate. But as far as like African Americans, I think less than 10% of the slave population was literate, and it wasn't that far as the free population. Now, in 1831, I don't know the numbers as far as like, you know, how many African Americans were free. I know like, what was it, 20 years after that, in 1850, you had about 434,000 free African Americans and 3.6 million slaves within that. I mean, overall, you know what I'm saying? Out of that 3.6 million was 434,000 African Americans. Now, as far as 20 years before that, in 1831, I don't know the exact statistic, but as far as Nat Turner, he is purported to have been literate. Probably not that literate. It is still a mystery as far as like how he was able to communicate to many different slaves, because he communicated to slaves outside of the plantation that he lived on as well. But as far as like the day that these events finally materialized, it's August the 21st, actually, August the 21st. And this rebellion lasted for about 2 days. They went from plantation to plantation in Virginia, killing people. They killed like a total, initially they started off, they killed like anywhere between 55 and 65 white persons, including children. Overall, at least 70 white people that they had killed within a span of 2 days, using hacks, axes, tools, etc. So all these people that they killed viciously. The rebellion was put down on the 23rd, someplace called the Belmont Plantation near Capron, Virginia, Capron, Southampton, Virginia. And Nat Turner himself escaped for about 2 months. But during this whole time, that's when things worsened around the country. It had created a large panic, because that was a rebellion that had stood out. Now, going back to Harper Williams, for example. Now, Harper Williams touched on the whole thing about rebellion as well. But in touching on it, again, he went back to his main premise as far as talking about black people and the bruteness. He believed that, black people were brutes, but as far as like those in captivity, they were pretty much not just subjugated, but loyal. You know what I mean? He didn't necessarily use the term loyal, but how he described the behavior as it relates between the slave and his slave master and the slave to white people in general. Like he referred to black African slaves, well, actually just African American slaves, period, as being trustworthy. You could trust them not to. He said the majority of them would not escape. The majority of them would not harm their masters. They were pretty much benign for the most part. And the rebellions that happen are so less, you know what I mean? Like he was saying, like the abolitionists, the way that they describe slavery back in the day, aside from them just, from his point of view, embellishing everything, he was saying like they made it seem like there were slave rebellions all the time, like this is a normality that took place, you know what I mean? And basically, like when things like that did take place, they'll harp on it and make a big deal out of it. That's what he was saying. Now I checked the statistics, right? It's a guy named Apotheker, a scholar, who this is based on. He did his research, and of course he had like a framework for this. He didn't count any slave rebellions that consisted of a very small amount of people. Like if it was less than 10, they didn't count it. So as far as like rebellions under that definition, 10 or more people who truly want to get free or whatnot, there was a total about, I think he said 250 slave rebellions, period, or whatnot. Now, this adds to how the chapter describes Nat Turner, because when they bring up Nat Turner, they bring him up when they're talking about John Brown. You know what I mean? And that was at the point where, with John Brown, he was preparing for Harper Ferry, and they were saying like he had learned his lessons throughout history, because Nat Turner was another person that he respected, that he had respect for, at least in his mind, that rebellion. And so he'll consider that rebellion when planning for his Harper Ferry raid or whatnot, while living at Frederick Douglass's crib in Rochester, New York, or whatnot. So that's like, they kind of brushed over Nat Turner, but again, I feel like he's important because it's leading to the Civil War. So as I'm going in chronological order, I'm talking about him now and fleshing him out a little bit more than what the book mentions, because like I say, they just brushed over him. So I'm keeping this in tangent still. But as far as him, this rebellion created a big ass, serious, wide panic amongst white folks. And as far as like literacy, this was when laws were put in place after this rebellion to not teach African Americans to read. And as far as like those who were preaching at churches, they would have to have a white person around them. In other words, the law made it legal for them to be encroached after this. Now, as far as like Nat Turner, before I go further on that, he got caught in